In the early years of the 17th century, Dutch voyages in the East Indies were driven by profit, roots, and intelligence, not romance. One small ship, the Duyfken, left the familiar waters of trade and edged toward an unknown southern coastline, carrying sailors who expected charts and anchors to solve problems that could not be solved with maps alone. The captain, Willem Janszoon, treated the voyage as reconnaissance, find land, water, and answers. The expedition is commonly placed in the year 1606, when the Duyfken reached the northern edge of what is now Australia, near the Gulf of Carpentaria. European crews did not yet understand the shape of this continent, and some still believed the coast might connect to New Guinea. Janszoon's decisions, where to sail, where to stop, and when to risk a landing, would shape what the Dutch wrote down as known world. From the sea, the coast looked low, harsh, and difficult. Tidal flats, mangroves, and long stretches where boats could ground in mud. Yet a ship cannot live on curiosity. Fresh water mattered, repairs mattered, and contact mattered, because trade or information could only be tested on shore. Every landing was also a gamble because the crew did not know the people, the rules, or the consequences of stepping onto someone else's country with armed strangers. Early Dutch records tended to name places from shipboard experience, not from local languages, and one name became a warning. Cape Keerweer, the Cape of turning back. The name itself suggests that something went wrong badly enough to change the plan. Near this area, accounts describe a landing attempt that met armed resistance, turning a practical shore visit into a violent clash, with reports of deaths among Janszoon's men. In documentary terms, this is not a grand battle, but a first sharp frontier collision. A small shore party from a European ship meets a local Aboriginal group defending its ground. The early record is thin and biased, often reducing motives to simple hostility, and it rarely preserves Indigenous names. That absence matters. It hides leadership and strategy behind silence, even when the outcome shows determined, organized refusal. For the Duyfken's crew, loss was not abstract. A small vessel depended on every sailor for sailing, rowing, guarding, and surviving illness or storms. If men were killed on shore, the ship's capacity to continue safely was damaged immediately. Fear also spreads fast on a cramped deck. One failed landing can turn every shoreline into a suspected trap, and every shadow in the trees into a warning that the next step could cost more lives. For the Aboriginal people of the region, the arrival was not a neutral visit. A boat landing means strangers entering a lived landscape of food places, pathways and law, carrying weapons and unknown intentions. Early Dutch writing does not explain Indigenous reasons in their own terms, but the logic of defense is plain. If the landing threatened safety or sovereignty, force could be used to push it back. The result, recorded by the Dutch, suggests that the push worked. Willem Janszoon's influence stands out because he controlled escalation. He chose the landing site, the size of the shore party, and the moment to withdraw. After the clash near Cape Keerweer, the voyage's rhythm changed from probing and testing to caution and avoidance. The Cape's name reads like a policy written onto geography. Turn back here. Do not repeat the same risk. Do not spend men for a coastline that answers contact with violence. The broader significance is how quickly discovery became a story of boundaries. A European expedition came seeking routes and advantage. A local group answered with resistance. The ship retreated, and that retreat shaped future choices. Dutch knowledge of the region grew through notes and sketches, but also through fear and memory. A single violent encounter could narrow ambition, redirect a route, and harden the expectation that this coast would not welcome landings on foreign terms. Part 1 ends with the moment the Duyfken turns contact into caution. The ship has reached the Australian coastline in the year 1606, attempted to land, and met armed conflict near Cape Keerweer, with reported deaths among Janszoon's men. The Dutch record keeps Indigenous leaders unnamed, but the outcome speaks. The landing was contested, the crew was shaken, and the voyage adjusted. In Part 2, we follow how that adjustment shaped the rest of the expedition and its legacy. After the clash near Cape Keerweer, the Duyfken's voyage stopped feeling like exploration and started feeling like damage control. A small ship cannot absorb losses the way a fleet can. If a few sailors are killed or wounded, every watch changes, every landing becomes harder, and every risk feels sharper. Janszoon had to decide whether more contact could bring fresh water and knowledge, or only more graves on a coast that had already answered with force. Dutch sailing in the East Indies was built on calculation. Wind, distance, profit, and the survival of crews who were already stretched thin. A captain who wastes men on an uncertain shore can be judged as reckless, even if he brings home new coastline. The Duyfken was not a warship sent to conquer, but a working vessel that needed to return with information. In that logic, turning back could be framed as discipline, not cowardice. The name Cape Keerweer, often translated as a cape of turning back, captures a decision as much as a place. Names on early charts were warnings to future pilots. Here the shore is hostile. Here the landing is dangerous. Here the ship's advantage disappears once boots touch mud. In documentary terms, the name is a scar in ink. It suggests that the encounter was remembered not as a minor skirmish, but as a turning point that redefined what possible meant for this voyage. What the Dutch wrote down about such moments was shaped by fear, pride, and limited understanding. European crews often described resistance as sudden aggression because they did not recognize the local laws of country, boundaries, and obligation. They also rarely recorded Indigenous names, partly because they could not hear them clearly, partly because they did not think they mattered to the report. Yet the outcome itself implies coordination. A local group acted decisively enough to stop further landings and force a strategic retreat. From the ship's perspective, the coastline was difficult, even without conflict. Shallow waters, shifting sandbanks, and wide tidal flats could trap boats and separate a landing party from the ship. If a shore party is attacked while the tide is wrong, rescue becomes impossible. That physical reality magnifies every human threat. A musket might misfire in damp air, a boat might ground, and panic can spread faster than orders. The geography was not neutral, it favored defenders who knew it. Janszoon's leadership shows most clearly in what he chose not to do. He did not escalate into a campaign of punishment on land, because the Duyfken did not have the manpower to hold ground or chase people through scrub. Instead, the ship's safety became the priority. Keep the crew intact, avoid repeated landings, and gather what could be gathered from offshore observation. In practice, that meant reconciling the desire for knowledge with the new certainty that contact could be lethal. For the Aboriginal people near Cape Keerweer, the encounter likely carried its own message. Strangers can be pushed back. Early Dutch writing does not preserve their reasoning, but the basic logic of defense is consistent across frontiers. A landing party is not just curious, it is armed, unpredictable, and potentially violent. If the first contact already involved threat, the response could be firm and immediate. The fact that the Duyfken turned away suggests that the defenders achieved what mattered most: control of access, of The voyage's legacy therefore became uneven. The Dutch gained a sliver of coastline knowledge, but also gained a powerful disincentive to return quickly. Information travels with emotion. A chart line is useful, yet a story of men killed on shore can shape policy for years. Later crews might treat the coast as a place to avoid, not a place to trade. In that way, resistance did not only defend one landing site. It could slow the rhythm of future intrusions and redirect attention elsewhere. This is why the expedition is often described as one of the earliest recorded European contacts with Australia. Not because it created lasting settlement, but because it left a trace that Europeans could file, copy, and fear. The record is partial, and it centers Dutch priorities, yet it still reveals a boundary being enforced. The Duyfken came as a probe. The coast answered with refusal. The probe withdrew. That is a contact story written through action more than dialogue. Part 2 ends with the expedition's new posture. Caution replaces confidence. In the year 1606, after deaths reported near Cape Keerweer, Willem Janszoon treats further landings as unacceptable risk, and the Duyfken's mission narrows to observation and safe return. The Dutch record keeps the indigenous side largely unnamed, but the result remains clear. Local resistance shaped the route, shaped the map, and shaped the memory. In Part 3, we follow how this episode was recorded and how later narratives reused it. When the Duyfken left the Cape Keerweer area behind, the most important cargo on board was no longer only specimens or coastline notes, but a story. Sailors carry stories the way they carry scars, compressed, repeated, sharpened by fear, and simplified for listeners who were not there. In the year 1606, a violent contact on an unknown shore could travel through Dutch ports and company offices as a warning. This land is not empty, and landing can cost lives. The earliest Dutch records of such voyages were shaped by what the voyage was meant to prove. The Dutch East India Company wanted routes, hazards, and practical geography, not long reflections on the people encountered. A report, therefore, tends to describe outcomes: killed, wounded, turned back, more than motives. If a landing failed, the record needed to justify why it failed without sounding incompetent. That pressure can push language towards certainty, even when the crew understood little of what they faced. This is one reason indigenous names are absent. Early Dutch writers often did not ask for names, did not record them clearly, or did not consider them necessary for the map. Where a European captain's name mattered for accountability, a local leader's name did not fit the reporting structure. Yet absence of names does not mean absence of leadership. It means the document is a European lens, narrow and functional, looking at a complex shore and only seeing what affects the ship's safety. The place name itself becomes part of the record. Keerweer, commonly read as turn back, works like a note pinned to the coastline. Do not push here. Such names on charts were not poetry. They were instructions for survival. When a map labels a cape with a decision, the decision is the story. A boundary met, a risk judged too high, a captain choosing return over persistence. In documentary terms, the name is testimony that something happened strongly enough to change the voyage's direction. Over time, repeated retellings can harden an encounter into a single dramatic scene. They landed, they were attacked, men died, they fled. Reality is usually messier. A contact might include tense approach, misunderstandings, warnings, a chase, and then violence. But early records rarely preserve that sequence in detail. They preserve what matters to the recorder, the loss and the lesson. That compression is how frontier encounters become first contacts in later narratives, even when the actual meeting was brief and chaotic. The ship's limitations also shaped what could be written. A small crew cannot hold ground, cannot mount long searches, and cannot safely rescue men trapped by tide and distance. That means the Dutch could not investigate deeply after a clash. They could not ask questions of the shore on equal footing. They could only infer intent from the moment of violence. In such conditions, the record naturally becomes one-sided, because the ship can leave but cannot stay to learn. Yet the recorded outcome still reveals indigenous agency. A local group near Cape Keerweer acted in a way that produced a strategic effect. It ended further landings and encouraged withdrawal. That is not passive reaction. It is control of access. Even without names, the act itself is a form of leadership, whether directed by a recognized figure or by collective decision under shared law. The Dutch may not have understood the social structure, but they understood the consequence. The coast could defend itself. Later European and colonial writers would reuse this episode differently, depending on their agenda. Some would frame it as hostility that justified caution or punishment. Others would treat it as a footnote to exploration, focusing on the map rather than the people. Modern documentary telling must resist both extremes, neither romanticizing the Dutch as pure explorers nor flattening Aboriginal resistance into an unexplained attack. The safest historical claim is the narrow one. A landing led to armed conflict, Dutch losses were reported, and the expedition turned back. There is also an ethical dimension in how first contact is remembered. For the Dutch, it was a dangerous episode on a voyage. For the local Aboriginal group, it was a defense of country from armed strangers arriving by sea. Those are different histories of the same moment. The archive preserves the Dutch voice more clearly, but the action preserves the indigenous position. They refused access effectively. The imbalance of record should not be mistaken for an imbalance of power in that specific encounter. Part 3 ends with the documentary problem at the heart of Cape Keerweer. The written record is thin, yet the impact is unmistakable. In the year 1606, Willem Janszoon's expedition recorded a violent contact and a retreat. And that retreat became embedded in names and memory. The Dutch file gave Europe a coastline fragment and a warning. In Part 4, we trace how such warnings shaped later approaches to the northern Australian shore, and how fear can guide navigation as strongly as wind. After the Duyfken's withdrawal in the year 1606, the practical outcome was simple. The voyage did not turn into a sustained exploration of that coast. In documentary terms, the retreat became a navigation rule. Sailors learn coastlines not only by sounding depth and reading currents, but by learning where people will let you step ashore. Cape Keerweer entered that mental map as a place where landing carried an immediate price. In the Dutch maritime world, a single violent contact could echo far beyond the ship's log. Captains brief other captains. Merchants ask whether a route is worth the risk. Company officials want predictable returns, not uncertain confrontations. A report that includes deaths or serious injury discourages repeat attempts unless the reward is clear. The northern Australian shore offered no obvious spice ports or established trade in Dutch eyes at that moment, so the incentive to press harder was limited. This is how fear becomes policy without being written as policy. No proclamation is needed. The logic is operational. Avoid unnecessary shore contact, keep the ship safe, and gather information from a distance when possible. That means more cautious approaches, fewer landings, and an emphasis on mapping from the sea. The coast becomes a line to be traced rather than a place to be entered. In that way, indigenous resistance can shape European knowledge itself, because it shapes where Europeans dare to stand. The incident also likely encouraged a particular interpretation among Europeans, that the land was dangerous in a human sense, not just in reefs and shoals. Once that idea spreads, it colors every later sighting. A distant figure on a beach becomes a threat rather than a potential trading partner. A shouted warning becomes attack. In frontier settings, expectation can be as decisive as weaponry. The Duyfken episode therefore mattered not only for what happened, but for what later crews assumed would happen. At the same time, later Dutch voyages in the broader region show that avoidance was never absolute. Mariners still chased knowledge and advantage, but knowledge could be gathered in a way that reduced vulnerability. By keeping boats close to the ship, by limiting time ashore, by choosing landing spots with easier retreat, and by treating unknown groups with heightened suspicion. Such procedures can lower immediate risk, yet they also increase the chance of misunderstanding because they begin from distrust. From the indigenous side, the warning effect is equally important. A successful defense becomes a lesson that can spread through nearby groups by oral report. Strangers arrive by sea. They carry weapons. They can be pushed back if confronted decisively. Even if the details shift in retelling, the core message is practical. It informs future responses. Watch the shoreline, control the landing points, and deny safe access. This is not a static reaction. It is adaptive strategy rooted in place and experience. The absence of recorded indigenous names in Dutch documents makes it tempting for later storytellers to treat the defenders as faceless. Documentary framing should do the opposite. Emphasize that facelessness is an artifact of the archive, not of the event. A local group acted with enough coordination to end further landings in that area. Coordination implies decision-making. Decision-making implies leadership, whether formal or situational. The ship's log does not need to confirm a name for leadership to have existed. Over time, the Cape Keerweer clash also became part of a broader pattern in how Europeans narrated first contact. A brief violent encounter can be retold as evidence that a whole coastline was uniformly hostile, when in reality the response could vary by place, timing, and behavior. That generalization is a common frontier distortion. It turns a local event into a universal rule, and universal rules then justify later aggression as inevitable. The documentary task is to keep the scale honest. One location, one landing, one clash, one withdrawal, then a ripple of caution. Another consequence is how naming practices lock memory into geography. When Europeans label a point with a warning name, the warning persists even when the original context is forgotten. A later sailor may not remember exactly what happened, but he sees the name and expects danger. The map becomes a transmitter of fear across generations. That is a powerful historical mechanism. Violence leaves marks not only on bodies, but on place names that steer future choices. Part 4 closes on the central dynamic. In the year 1606, an armed conflict at Cape Keerweer did more than injure or kill men on a small ship. It taught Europeans caution and taught local Aboriginal defenders that the seaborne intruders could be forced to retreat. Each side carried the lesson forward in different ways, through reports and maps on one side, through story and shoreline vigilance on the other. In Part 5, we bring the story to its documentary conclusion. What can be said with confidence, what remains uncertain, and why this early contact matters to the long history of Australia's frontiers. The expedition of Willem Janszoon aboard the Duyfken in the year 1606 sites at the edge of recorded history like a scar line on a chart, brief, sharp, and decisive in its consequence. It is often described as one of the earliest documented European contacts with the Australian continent. Yet what makes it documentary-worthy is not a grand discovery scene. It is the opposite: a landing that met resistance, a clash that drew blood, and a retreat that quietly set limits on what Europeans would attempt next. The core sequence, as preserved in later summaries and institutional retellings, is straightforward. A Dutch ship operating under a trading and reconnaissance logic sailed into northern waters, traced unfamiliar shoreline, and attempted one or more landings. Near Cape Keerweer, a conflict broke out between the landing party and local Aboriginal people. Reports state that men from Janszoon's side were killed. After that, the ship withdrew from that coast. Even without a detailed battlefield narrative, the structure is clear: contact, violence, loss, withdrawal. What we do not have is equally important. The earliest Dutch records rarely preserve the names of Aboriginal individuals or specific local group identities in a way a modern historian would want. That absence is not proof that there were no leaders. It is proof of what the European record keepers considered worth writing down. The archive here is asymmetrical by design. It is a European travel account, built to serve navigation and company interests. It measures coastlines, risks and outcomes, not indigenous politics or kinship. Because of that, documentary accuracy requires disciplined phrasing. We can say that a local Aboriginal group confronted the landing with enough force and coordination to cause fatalities and stop further landings in that immediate area. We cannot responsibly invent dialogue, names, or precise numbers of Aboriginal casualties when the sources do not provide them. We can say the Europeans perceived the place as dangerous, and that perception shaped later caution. We should also say that the defenders likely perceived the landing as threat or intrusion into their law and space, and responded accordingly. The event's historical weight comes from how early it sits in the timeline of northern coastal encounters, and from how it demonstrates a reality that later frontier histories often tried to erase. Indigenous people were not passive in first contacts. A small landing party is vulnerable. Even firearms do not guarantee control if the terrain, timing, and local resolve are against you. The Duyfken episode shows that the first written contact could already be a contest over access, not a handshake. It also shows how European exploration was shaped by human resistance as much as by reefs and currents. When a captain loses men in an unfamiliar place with no obvious immediate profit, the rational response is caution. That caution becomes a navigational habit. Fewer landings, more distance, faster departures. Over time, those habits shape what gets mapped, what gets described, and what remains unknown. In that sense, the defenders influenced European knowledge production because they influenced where Europeans could safely stand. There is another layer: how place names transmit memory. A warning name on a map can preserve the emotional meaning of an event long after details fade. Later crews may not know the exact story, but they see the label and expect danger. That expectation can harden into stereotype, and stereotype can later be used to justify preemptive violence. So an early clash can echo forward, not only as a fact, but as a mood that travels through maritime culture and into later colonial attitudes. Yet this story should not be flattened into inevitability. A violent contact at one point on one voyage does not mean every possible encounter had to be violent. It means that this encounter, in this place, under these conditions, became violent and ended in retreat. Documentary framing should keep the scale honest while still showing consequence. The incident is small in numbers compared to later wars, but huge in symbolic timing because it sits so early and because it shows resistance from the start. If we step back, the Duyfken clash belongs to a longer pattern in world history. Early coastal reconnaissance meets communities who have every reason to defend landing zones. European ships often arrived with demands, misunderstandings, and implicit claims. Local people responded according to their law, their experience, and their assessment of threat. Sometimes trade emerged, sometimes avoidance, sometimes violence. Here, the recorded outcome is violence and withdrawal, which tells us as much about Indigenous agency as it does about Dutch limitation. The documentary conclusion is therefore stark and clean. In the year 1606, on the northern Australian coast near Cape Keerweer, Willem Janszoon's expedition attempted contact and met armed resistance that caused deaths among his men and forced retreat. The sources leave gaps, especially on Indigenous identities and exact details, but the consequence is visible. An early warning stamped into European memory that this shoreline could not be taken for granted. It is a first contact story not of welcome, but of refusal, and that refusal shaped what came after.